Hello, folks. I'm here a couple minutes early just because my producer is out today because thanks to the weather. So I just wanted to make sure I actually connected. And can you hear me and see me? Patrick, can you see me? Can you hear me? Okay, good. All right. Well, those of you who are here early, you can ask me other questions that nobody else can ask. How about that? Thanks for joining. I appreciate it. All right, we're just gonna kind of hold off for a little bit. It's always a little bit early, unusual doing this early. I don't have my, I can't exactly share the intro that my producer normally has, but I'm glad you folks are here. So, if anybody has any questions before we officially get started at on the half hour, um, I don't want people to miss anything, but it's perfectly okay to ask questions right now too. Or throw topics at me I can talk about when we actually start the show. Again, we're doing this a little bit early tonight, just so I can make sure that all the tech was working, since I had some problems earlier today testing it out. But thank you all for being here. Um, and we'll just kind of hold off. This is one of those times that if I was just on Zoom, I could do all sorts of fun things. But with these live things for this, it's a little difficult. Patrick, I'm glad you're. Graham Nichols does a great job with that out of body experience course. Could you explain what psychic vectors are? Um, what comic book did you read that in? Because that's going to depend on my answer, honestly. Because we don't have psychic vectors in parapsychology unless you want to consider that a vector can sometimes be an attribute or direction. So, if it was an X-Men comic, it might be different than if it was, let's say, the Martian Manhunter on the DC side or in some other things at all. Tina, you saw Bill Murray and the Blood Brothers. Cool. Very cool. I did not know it was John Belushi's birthday either. How can an apparition seem to have weight? Creaking floors and sitting down on objects seem to show an impression. That's a really good question. Okay, so why don't we get started here? People will join on the half hour and they can go back over the recording if they want to. So I'll call this an official start of Ask Professor Paranormal, even though it's about 2 minutes early tonight. That is a very good question. In fact, it's a question we really can't directly answer. All I can say is that apparitions being consciousness, when people experience an apparition, including physically experience something, they are experiencing something coming to their minds directly. But some apparitions apparently can affect physical environment. That's why we occasionally have apparition cases, rare, but we occasionally have them where objects will move. They're usually not as chaotic as a poltergeist case, but things can physically happen. In those cases, if you've got a situation where an apparition can do psychokinesis, mind over matter, they themselves may believe that they have weight or that they have an effect on the floor, the bed, and things like that. It also could be a cooperative between the apparition and the person who's experiencing it, because we certainly have PK abilities unconsciously as well. There's some unanswered questions quite a bit. I was just reading a collection of Marvel stories by J. Michael Straczynski, and one was an interaction between Bruce Banner and Dr. Strange, where Bruce Banner wanted to find out why he became the Hulk, specifically in that incarnation. And Dr. Strange is going to send him out of his body and into the past. So an astral projection thing. And the question came up is, why do ghosts have, why do we have clothing when we're out of body? In other words, why do ghosts have clothes? And there's a panel where the two of them are looking at each other, and Dr. Strange says, nobody knows. And then the faces turn to to face outward as if breaking the fourth wall. It was a very, very funny piece. I'll be using it in lectures, actually. We have an idea that it's all about the apparition's self-image and idea what they are, but that's about all it is. Hey, Paul. Oh, I'm glad you discovered this channel and my other videos as well. Potential energy transforming into kinetic energy. I mean, we don't know when it comes to psychokinesis. There are different ideas about how that even works. We don't know that ghosts, consciousness is energy per se. There are other concepts of what consciousness outside the body might be made out of. That we mean, what is a ghost made out of? Could be energy of a form we haven't been able to detect. We don't know about. Could be somebody suggested a quantum particle field that can still interact with the physical world. We don't really. There's a lot we don't know from physics for these things, unfortunately. So if you start throwing the Higgs boson around, they only just discovered that not too long ago. So for real, even though it was mathematically described, we don't know, and that's something we don't know what consciousness is in the body, let alone outside the body. So it's still a very difficult question there. And so Ryan, going back to Ryan, it was Spider-Man. Madam Web, she said she can't see into the future because of vectors. Well, the vectors in that Spider-Man comic book, given that Marvel does talk about alternative timelines, could very well have been that was a vector. From this point, when you make a decision, a yes or no decision, there are two directions you can go, two decision points, yes or no, or three, if you want to count non-decision, and each one of those is a vector. So that could have been what was talked about there. But otherwise, there aren't psychic vectors as we talk about in the field at all. The vectors were not aligned at this time. That's like saying, the powers that be are not aligned at this time. It's comic books. Yes, Patrick, there were studies in the early 1900s. I have that paper, in fact. The problem is that there were questions, looking back at that paper and the controls that were there, a lot of questions about it, and it was replicated, and there was not weight. In other words, there was no weight loss when the animal died. Because it was they used animals at that point. There are attempts at studies, but there are ethical issues if you do it with human beings. It is possible. John Kruth had a proposal, which unfortunately didn't get funded, to do it with people who could go out of body, to see if somebody went out of body, they would be on a sort of a bed that had a very delicate scale, but everything, it's kind of like any food scale you use at home. You first zero it out. If you put the plate on it, you zero it out. And then whatever you put on it, you're getting the actual weight of the food, not the plate as well. So that was the whole idea of this, but didn't have the funding or the wherewithal to do it. Still a question, but right now it does not look like there is appreciable weight loss. That was 21 grams, I think, is what it was in that particular study. Would you like to be interviewed with Robert Kuhn? Yeah, love to. Love his stuff. I've read a lot of stuff recently with his whole consciousness studies that he's been doing. But yeah, sure, I'd be very happy to be interviewed by him. I typically don't turn down many podcasts if they can fit in my schedule. And in fact, typically, I get a lot of requests for podcast interviews. And if you go to my webpage, to LoydAuerbach.com, and click on the media page, the tab for media, you will see I haven't even listed everything I've done. And I'm trying to keep up with the more recent ones that are coming up. And many of them are pre-recorded, so I couldn't, the new ones coming up. I've got a couple coming up that are going to be pre-recorded, and I'm not sure exactly when the date is yet. They haven't told me the specific date is going to air. But if I can fit them into my schedule, I typically don't turn anybody away. Although there's somebody now, let's just say that there was some contentious, nasty stuff posted as a reply or a post under a comment on something I posted on Facebook by someone who hosts a podcast. In fact, the last time I did it was in June, and I won't do his podcast again. So I don't like being called names for other things, and it was nothing to do with paranormal. So, but still, let's see here. Yeah, that Patrick, they would, they can't weigh people after death to see if there's a change. They have to weigh people in the dying process. They have to weigh them at the before the moment of death and after they've died. And you have to do it in such a way because the body does lose fluids, including crap, so to speak. Sometimes the bladder empties out, the colon empties out. You got to do it with the body there on that scale, and it's going to be very sensitive. Also, you got to make sure that when there's movement, that doesn't affect the weight too much. So, it's difficult to do that specific thing. Did you mention something about the Earth's magnetic field affects psychic abilities? Yeah, Michael Persinger and with Charles Tart and Stanley Krippner and others back in the 80s did some studies looking at the correlations between highs and lows of the localized Earth magnetic field of the Earth, so geomagnetic field. So in other words, we have kind of a global geomagnetic field, and at the local level, it fluctuates, and the fluctuations can be weather related, tidal, where the moon is in position of that, can be solar related, in other words, solar flares, things like that. So all of that can affect the local geomagnetic field. Also, Earth movements, even though you may not feel an earthquake, there can be movements of magma and even on the fault lines that may not generate enough of an earthquake to do anything. All of that changes the Earth's magnetic field. And when the geomagnetic field goes up, there were certain correlations to psychic experience, mainly precognition and psychokinesis, as if you're pumping up the volume. When they went down, the field went down, it was more telepathy, clairvoyance, remote viewing type experiences. Others, like Serena Roney Dougal in the UK, who wrote a book about this whole stuff, Where Science and Magic Meets is the name of the book. She suggested it was not the fact that it was high, it was the direction of the high, of the energy, the shift going up or going down. Because one of the things in our body that the brain itself is affected by the Earth's magnetic field to some extent. Persinger also did some studies with simulating the Earth magnetic field changes using a helmet. It has some interesting results. But it also affects the pineal gland, what the ancients call the third eye, which until a few decades ago, people thought was like the appendix and had no function. It actually regulates serotonin and melatonin in the body. So it's important. It's an important gland. And the Earth's magnetic field affects that. And that might have something to do with it. And Scott Rogo, the late Scott Rogo, suggested that for some things, like especially precognition, it would be interesting to see if the Earth's magnetic field goes up and I have a precognitive experience. Let's say it's for something that happens a week from today, this time. In a week from today at this time, let's look at the geomagnetic field and see if it's the same level. So is there a connection, not just between the direction or the strength of the field, but also kind of like a frequency connection? Is it the same level? Is that why I'm connecting with that time period? That kind of thing. So all very, very good, good stuff that's out there. But we have looked for decades at EMF in general and in the environment. Why you see ghost hunters running around with K2 meters, which by the way are crap, and any other magnetic field detector, is looking to see if there's a correlation. And we look for correlations, not causation, but connections with changes in the environment and psychic experience. Sometimes there may be a causal factor, but it may just be that field change is affected or caused by the same thing that makes us have the experience. So in other words, the field was a byproduct of whatever it is made us psychic in that moment. We don't really have enough information about that. Again, we don't have the data across the board, and we clearly know, by the way, that ghosts, apparitions are not electromagnetic in nature. They are not made of electromagnetic anything. We know that. And there's very, very little correlation between EMF changes and an apparition. Now, between hauntings, residual hauntings, and EMF, there's a much more of a correlation that's there. There are other reasons why we know that ghosts are not electromagnetic in nature, but won't go into them right here. You can take my field investigations class, which starts on February 2nd. through the Rhine Education Center. It's Rhine ED. The courses are going to start actually February 2nd is the first week of classes. I'm teaching field investigations, an 8-week class. I'm also teaching starting on Tuesday night, the 3rd, Dreams and Altered States, another 8-week class. And then there's going to be a class offered on religion and parapsychology, which will be a really interesting one, taught by Jimmy Aiken. The couple other classes, including one by Graham Watkins on having an out-of-body experience, all of that. And then I'll be teaching a course on how technology and equipment and stuff relates to investigations, kind of a separate deep dive in March as well. So take a look at the classes that are listed there. They're on that website. It's there. Let's see here. Ed Kelly's work at Division of Perceptual Studies at University of Virginia is exceptional. And I've known Ed for a really long time. Have you ever had a particularly unpleasant interview? Yes, I have. There have been a couple times that I'm just trying to remember specifically. I can tell you the most unpleasant interviews that were not on television were back in the 80s when my first book came out, when ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists came out. And by the way, I'm revising ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists a little bit, updating some things. And it'll be out hopefully by the end of February, but definitely by mid-March. 40th anniversary edition. So I'll let you know about that. I was interviewed I did a lot of radio interviews in 1984, and then starting when my book came out in 86 because of Ghostbusters. And I did I did a lot of interviews in 86 when the book came out in October that year. I did some television, including the Today Show and a few others. And then I was doing dozens of radio interviews. This is before podcasting, of course. And I had one interviewer who shall remain nameless at this point. The publisher did send copies of the books out to anybody who requested them, who were doing radio interviews. And I had this interview where it was very clear that I didn't matter so much the guy hadn't read the book. That was one thing. But it was very clear that the only questions he was asking, or he started asking, were the questions on the back cover of the book. In fact, almost everything he referenced through the interview was from the back cover of the book, which, by the way, was written by the sales department, sales and marketing at Warner Books, not by me. That was not a good interview, I can tell you that. There have been some other similar ones where the interviewer, and this is with podcasts too, sometimes they ask for questions up front. And I give them a list of potential questions. And sometimes the interviewer just asks one question right after the other with no follow-up to any of the responses, which means I have to change the topic in order to get some additional information out. And then I'll tell you about one of the worst situations I had, unpleasant, with television. In fact, I was just talking to somebody involved in that situation 2 days ago who had called me. I hadn't spoken to her in decades. So there was this case in Wisconsin, a poltergeist case, stuff moving around, things like that, that a local reporter, Rachel Anastasi from the Milwaukee Sentinel, wanted to do an article about. It was in a town called, oddly enough, Horicon. And, she fed me all the information, and I talked in the interviews with her, well done interviews in the paper about what I thought it was, why I thought it was this, and so on. Unsolved Mysteries, a couple of years later, decided they wanted to do that case as a piece. They were, the couple that lived in the house had already moved. So there were new people living in the house who were not experiencing anything because it was a poltergeist case related to the couple, not related to the house. And they were able to get permission to track down the couple and interview them only in shadow without using their names, full names. And I went out to the house. The crew, for whatever reason, it was like an hour and a half from the Milwaukee airport. And the crew, for whatever reason, they didn't have somebody to come pick me up. And so I was going to take a cab out or something. But we got permission for Rachel to come with me and do a follow-up story. So she picked me up at the airport, drove me out to Horicon. We were there overnight and was on site. So the director, they interviewed the couple that was living there. They were going to interview the previous couple after I had flown back to the Bay Area, and so they're talking to me about this. And the director is constantly pushing me to say this was demonic, that there were demons here. And I said, no, this is a typical poltergeist case relating to people's unconscious mind. And he was trying to get it. Can you say it this way? No, I can't. I just refused because he was going for this case was demon involved. This case was evil and all that. And even the couple who experienced it, while it was really initially frightening and it really became annoying to them, they did not think it was evil, demonic, or even dangerous. That came out in the interview that he did the next day. So he was also really mad that the production people, the people above him, had given permission for a reporter to be there while I was being interviewed. So Rachel wrote something up. It appeared in the paper the morning I had flown up, after I'd flown back the night. In fact, Rachel had to take me back to the airport because they didn't have anybody. And it was just a really bad experience with that director. I will say that the next morning, I get a call that woke me up because the paper was already out, Rachel's story. And it was a decent story, but I was yelled at for having a reporter there. I mean, it was, even though there was permission, it was just absolutely absurd. It got to a point where I had to write a letter to the head of CBS and to Cosgrove Muir, the production company, explaining the situation and basically saying, how dare you? How dare he, the director, do all this? Because it was all about the director more than anything else. The letter was copied also. Went to Cosgrove Muir, was copied to the president of CBS, who my dad knew. My dad had worked for NBC. And it was copied to my uncle Larry, who was on the Directors Guild board. So nothing came of it. I did get a note saying, a postcard saying your episode is going to air. And of course, I was not in the episode. Instead, they found a local preacher to talk about demons. My understanding is that director got fired later on for something else. So anyway, that was a really bad experience. They did pay me, so at least that was a good thing. Okay, let me go back to the Q&A here, the questions. I see that you all stopped for a minute. So it says, when the moon is full, my dreams are often more intense or strange. Any studies of the moon affecting psychic abilities? Not specifically. There have been certainly studies of the phases of the moon. People used to think that, well, the word lunacy or lunatic comes from people thinking that the full moon caused people to be crazy or crazier. And there's some evidence that tidal forces that, the moon's phases and changes in the moon do affect the geomagnetic field, and that potentially could affect our brains to some extent, but not making us crazy. I talked to one cop years ago who said, when we were talking about this, he said basically, because there have been studies that show there was more crime when the moon was full than when the moon was not full. Let's say it was just a new moon. And this one police officer said, yeah, because they don't need flashlights as much. The full moon shines a light quite a bit more. Deadline for the devices course. All right. That course does not start till the first week of March. You have until the first week of March before you decide. And that's going to be a 4-week class. Let's see. Initial transcranial magnetic stimulation seems to show promise in treatment-resistant depression. Not that specifically to my understanding. Of course, that's Michael Persinger did work with magnetic stimulation using a frequency similar to the Earth's magnetic field, not what's magnetic transcranial magnetic stimulation. There were studies back in the 80s of using electrical stimulation and magnetic stimulation to heal bones faster. It seemed to have a positive effect on that. Magnetic stimulation, because we have magnetite particles in our brain tissue. Magnetite is a mineral that it's like lodestone. It's magnetic. Very small particles, but we have them. That was something that was the Mayo Clinic or Stanford University. There were studies that were published back in the 90s on that, around 1994. So anything magnetic technically could affect the cellular structure and could affect neurological, electrochemical stimulation, things like that. So I haven't heard of anything being done with psychic ability at this point. Are you familiar with the ex-ghost hunter Christina Costanza claims to have begun seeing tar beings and goblin faces? Um, Not offhand. I don't know that name off the top of my head. And when people hear voices on the EVP, I assume other than just the EVP, it's all pareidolia. I mean, it's so easy to hear things in static, especially that's not really there. Please do audiobook versions. You can start by reading each chapter aloud during your writing process. All right, so I will tell you that it's not the reading of the chapters that takes a lot of time. I mean, I would not mind doing reading for any of my books. The problem is actually editing. The editing takes twice, maybe three times as long to do, and I just don't have the wherewithal or time to do that. I mean, I could read the chapters. I probably wouldn't read them as I'm writing them because I would still need to edit the chapter after I've written it, make changes and things like that. So much as I would like to do that sort of thing, I opted recently. Amazon was offering us. I've published several self-publishing books using KDP Publishing. That's their Kindle Direct, and you can find them on Amazon. That's where the Amazon listings. And there are a couple of a few of the audio books: the Paranormal Casebook, ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists, Reincarnation Channeling and Possession is another one. I'm trying to think if I did that. Those three for now. I did. They were offering a free. It is an AI voice, but it sounds pretty human. It's very most of the AI voices now are much better than they were. I was able to choose a voice from about 60. And the one thing I will say is not good with the AI right now with the voices. It's still very listenable until the system gets to a written URL for a website. Then it gets weird. So sometimes for numbers, it gets a little weird too, especially years. But it's pretty good. So I've made them I think about the same price as the paperback, not the paperback, as the Kindle book. And I'll probably do some sales on that. But again, I would love to do that, to do the reading, but I just don't have the wherewithal or time or money to pay someone to do the editing, to actually do the editing myself for that. All right, but they are there. So there are some things there. I can't do anything with the books that have been published by publishers that are still in the publisher's rights. So Psychic Dreaming or The Ghost Detective's Guide to Haunted San Francisco, or the Ghost Hunting or Hauntings and Poltergeists, they're through publishers, and I can't do anything about those. Hopefully with Mind Over Matter will be reprinted by Paranormal Daily News is starting a publishing arm, and that's where that book's going to be reprinted in the next few months. We've kind of been holding it back until they were ready, and I think we're going to work on audiobooks there. So as long as I can read the book, they can get the editing done, we'll get that taken care of, hopefully. What is the success rate of contacting spirits? As in, how likely is the average person to actually summon a spirit, not trying? Well, technically, what we hear from mediums is we all can connect if we put ourselves in the right mindset. But let's take the professional mediums. And I've worked with many through the Forever Family Foundation. I've worked with many outside the Forever Family Foundation. The Forever Family Foundation does do testing, scientific process to find evidential mediums. The Windbridge Research Center has evidential research mediums. One good friend of mine, Ankasha Amenti, really evidential. Not a Forever Family medium, but a Windbridge medium. And then I work with a medium named Mariah Kunau, who's exceptionally good. I've worked with others in the past. My late friend Annette Martin was a phenomenal medium. They can get in the right mindset to see if spirits are willing to be contacted. The one thing you hear from a good medium, by the way, is that so let's say you have somebody come in for a reading or in a gallery situation, we're a large group. The one issue that pops up again and again, and it affects their Yelp rating sometimes too, is that the mediums cannot contact someone the person who you might want to contact. So if I wanted to contact my grandfather, and that's the only one spirit I wanted to talk to, and I'm with a medium, and instead my grandfather doesn't come through, my grandmother comes through, or perhaps one of my deceased uncles comes through, and it's very clearly one of those people. The medium did not contact who I wanted to contact. So, not a good medium. That's what we hear. In fact, we see that in some of the ratings and feedback from some of the events for the Forever Family Foundation. And that's ridiculous because every medium will tell you that there has to be, it's a two-way communication. It's not just the medium, it's also the person on the other side. And if that spirit, if that individual is not available or wanting to speak because someone else should be speaking to you as the client instead, that's not the medium's fault. I kind of liken it to making a phone call. And here, let's talk about landlines, if anybody still has one. I'm sure you remember these. You call somebody, a friend's house, and think back to when you were in high school or something like that. You call a friend's house on the phone before cell phones, and a brother, sister, parent picks up the phone. You're trying to call your friend Phil, and the person who picked up the phone, you say, "Hey, is Phil there?" And they say, "No, Phil's not available," or "Phil's not here." And normally, you're not going to continue to talk to the person because you just wanted to call Phil. But when it comes to spirits, they may have more important stuff to tell you. In fact, that parent who answered Phil's phone might want to tell you something more about what's going on with Phil. So just realize that this is like a phone call, that if the person's not home, not available, or that there's someone else, this especially happens with family, someone else who has a message or more important information to give you or needs to talk to you for whatever reason, that's going to happen. But for us individuals calling down a spirit, there are books out there on by mediums on how to communicate. I would suggest reading some of those. That'd be this way. Let's see here. If ghost clothes are tied to self-image, what about animals? What ways do animals view themselves? Well, that's a good question. People, the majority of animal ghosts, actual conscious ghosts that are seen, as opposed to, let's say, an imprint, tend to be our pets who have passed away, and they tend to be seen, if you see them, the same way they appeared when they were alive. And so maybe that's a self-image, maybe it's your interpretation of what's coming through because you knew what they look like. So it's hard. We can't really ask the animal the same way. And I know that there are pet psychics who claim to be able to translate what the animal's thinking. All of that's definitely through the interpretation of that pet psychic. So, and thank you, Paul, for mentioning both the Forever Family Foundation, which is foreverfamilyfoundation.org. It's in the channel. There's a link in the channel description, the channel description, not the episode description. Windbridge Research Center is windbridge.org. They do phenomenal research on spirit mediumship and other topics, EVP and things like that. They have a great website with a lot of good, excellent information, just some fact sheets and also some of their access to their papers for that. Melody, welcome. What percentage of reported paranormal experiences do you estimate are hoaxes or insincere claims? Okay, first, that question initially. I don't know that we have any way of determining that. It depends on what you mean by reported paranormal experiences. So these are people calling ghost hunters to get an investigation, which would be, pretty much the majority of those kinds of experiences that are hoaxes. I know from personal experience when I used to deal with a lot of calls, don't really deal with any these days, too many ghost hunting groups. But if you go back to the heyday, when we got tons of calls at JFK University, we got tons of calls otherwise. I'd say it was probably 1 in 50 that was relatively insincere or prank calls. I mean, occasionally we get these prank calls on my voicemail, these clearly kids calling up and saying, "Oh, there's a demon here," something like that. Um, Hoaxes, out and out hoaxes to try to get somebody coming out. I'd say that's a little bit higher depending on who they're calling. In the calls that I took over the years, or some of my colleagues, I'd say it was pretty rare for hoax. And most of the time, it was one of two types of hoaxes or cases, one of which was not necessarily clearly a hoax, but we still didn't do the investigation. And that was someone saying that they have this activity in their house. And people do make misinterpretations all the time. So we're willing to kind of look past that. If they talk about all sorts of really extreme experiences, we that's one of the reasons why I have to have a pre-interview on the phone or on Zoom with someone before I'd consider doing an investigation. People do make misinterpretations, including misinterpreting normal experiences. But the insincere ones in those cases, which could be hoaxes, were from people who would call, let's say, the TAPS family groups that were out there. My late friend Pete Haviland in Texas, he said about 50% of the cases they went out on, and he would first pre-interview and get some good information. When they showed up, the first thing the family would say, or somebody would say, looking at them, is, "Where's Jason and Grant? Where's the TV crew?" In other words, these were people who wanted to be on TV. At which point, whether this was a real experience or not, Pete and his group turned around and left. And I've heard that also from other people. On occasion, I would get these calls, and it sounds like a good case, but then they're saying, "Hey, do you think we could write this up as a book? Would you help us out so we could sell this as a movie?" They wanted to do like a film, a major motion picture about this, or get film rights or book rights or something like that. Not going to do that. It's too questionable. And then the other kinds of hoaxes that I would get, these hoax calls, would be from skeptics trying to get me to acknowledge I'm going to do the investigation when things that they said were pretty clearly not true for that. The other question is, have you ever personally encountered someone who fabricated or exaggerated? Yes, we've had cases, which I had a case with, and by the way, exaggerated, yes, because people's emotions and psychology are also sometimes off. Mistakes, yes, but on occasion, run into cases where one family member was faking out the others. There were real psychological reasons for this happening. It wasn't just done as a prank, partly as a prank, but it was really, there were psychological issues in the back end. And it was not paranormal at all. It was one family member doing things to make others think this was the house was haunted. So that's more likely to be the kinds of things we run into. Bringing in an actual parapsychologist. Now, faking out ghost hunters, a lot of ghost hunting groups, fairly easy. Faking out parapsychologists who know what they're doing, not as easy, because we're going to keep at it until we figure out exactly what's going on. And on top of everything else, we look at every individual event in a case that's reported, as well as the overall case. And you can have a really good overall case where 50% of the things that people say are related to the ghost or the poltergeist have a normal explanation that the people just didn't look for, or was something that they didn't understand. Ever heard of radonautica? No, not heard of anything like that at all. Mobile exploration app. Yep, haven't heard about that one. So look it up. By setting a mental intention, users search for nearby anomalies or attractors, which has led to viral trends for unusual or mysterious finds in the surroundings. Okay, I haven't heard of that happening. I guess it would depend on what kind of anomalies or attractors you're talking about for that. I wonder why there aren't more wild animal apparitions. Probably because wild animals tended to avoid humans, and I would guess that their apparitions would do that too, if there are any that are out there. Any chance of an audio-only version? That's a interesting thing. Not for this one. This one is actually going straight through YouTube, but under normal circumstances, for the last few months, the show has been hosted on Zoom, and we use a system called OBS to port it over to YouTube. And Zoom does have an audio only, and I can strip that out from the recording too. So um, have to think about where to put that. I can possibly put that on my website. So let me think about that, and I should be able to do at least some of them on the website for sure. So good idea, very good idea. Also, because of something someone asked about being a guest on my show, as those of you who are regulars know, I only have done one interview. That was last time with Steve Gonzalez. We haven't decided whether or not we're going to do too many more interview shows. There are a couple of people I'd like to get on, but I have thought after someone asked me about this today about being an interview guest, given that you can upload videos to the YouTube channel as well, I was thinking that I would potentially do interviews with people. It wouldn't give people, you folks, a chance to ask them questions, but I might do some interviews with some of my colleagues or other folks and then put the video up on the YouTube channel. And in that case, I can also use the audio somewhere else. So we'll see what we can do there. Medic Jesus, I have had a pet cat that passed away jump on my bed a few times. And one time I heard her meow in my ear, which was a surprise. I've had experience, not jumping on the bed, but I've definitely had experience with a cat that passed away, a couple of my cats over the years, seeing them for a short time after they died. Yeah. And my friend Ankasha, who I mentioned earlier, really excellent medium up in the Seattle area, does stuff also by phone. She was when she used to live in Minnesota. She used to live in Minneapolis, and she would do weekend workshops at this one haunted bed and breakfast. There definitely was haunting at the bed and breakfast. And the woman who owned the place, I'm going to tell you a quick story. The woman had owned the place, had a pet cat, and somehow the cat would get into people's rooms even though the doors were closed, sometimes locked. This is when the cat was alive, mind you. Nobody ever figured out how the cat did that. So, but the cat was definitely alive when this happened. So she was there doing one event, and when the cat would get in people's rooms, the cat would jump into bed with some people, and definitely Ankasha had experienced that when the cat was alive. So she has this experience one night. This is down the road, and at breakfast, she tells the owner, "Yeah, the cat got in the room again. It was snuggling with me in bed." And the woman looked at her and said, "Oh, I'm sorry to tell you this, but she died a couple months ago." So apparently it was the cat's ghost. So kind of fun. We have these kinds of things. Ryan, we know the idiomotor response explains Ouija boards with other instances of a spirit board actually working with the spirit. Was physical medium. Well, physical mediumship is not needed at all. All that's needed for any sort of communication to be done is for the person operating the planchette. This goes back to automatic writing. A Ouija board, it's not the Ouija board, it's the planchette that points to the letters. And the planchette, and I've got one actually here. I have an old style planchette. And this planchette is the kind of planchette they used to have before the Ouija boards. And basically, so, it's got the legs and with rollers, but it also has a pen. This is a pencil, actually. You can kind of lock it down, and you'd place your hand on it. It's a much bigger one, and leave it on a piece of paper and let your unconscious do the writing. Or perhaps your unconscious would connect with the spirit and do the writing. So it's not, again, with the Ouija board, it's not the board, it's the planchette. So someone could ask for a spirit to come through and do the automatic writing. And usually you do it with your non-dominant hand. And there's also another version of this, which may still be sold. I've got it over here called the Ghost Writer, WRITER. It's another planchette. It's a little bit smaller than this one. And it also has a pen. You can put a big pen right through it. So technically you could, with a Ouija board, be getting psychic information, but it's pretty rare. It's not the optimal way to do that. It takes quite a long time, and I would never do it with other people on the planchette, because then you have unconscious minds fighting over that planchette. So I wouldn't typically do that. Let's see here. Physical mediumship is not needed. The only reason you use physical mediumship is if the planchette's going to move by itself. So I put the planchette on the Ouija board and starts moving by itself. That could be a form of physical mediumship. One of the sitters causing that unconscious mind to move. So again, it's psychokinesis, it's mind over matter. There aren't any cases of spirits without a human being involved moving the planchette on a Ouija board. Okay, Jimmy Akin said a while back that a parapsychologist went to investigate the case and inspired the Exorcism movie. Conclusion was poltergeist, not demon, possibly fraud. Yes. First of all, know that there were 4 cases, one predominant case with a young boy, and 3 other cases that William Peter Blatty used to construct the case that was in the Exorcist book. The movie took the information from the book. And the main case, I had some communication with, and I can't even recall which of my colleagues it was, but the case was investigated and it was determined it was a poltergeist case, but the religious overtones were there, as they often are in poltergeist cases, where people will, bring in someone from the church, all of that. But it was a poltergeist case, basically, for that. And the other thing, when we have poltergeist cases, on occasion, you do have fraud as part of that case. There's something that William G. Roll identified in about 14% of the cases, something called imitative fraud. And this can happen in a real case, an absolutely genuine, recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis case where there's stuff moving around. It's really clearly not fraud. But sometimes, especially if it involves kids, sometimes with adults, but usually it's kids that are involved. And it's not even necessarily the kid who is causing the phenomena unconsciously, but the kids or a kid determines, hey, if anything breaks, if anything happens, they're going to blame it on the ghost. And the kid starts doing stuff out of sight of people or behind their backs. It lets them blow off steam. Now, if it's the actual poltergeist agent, interestingly enough, the actual phenomena starts trailing off, because most poltergeist cases are caused by psychological or emotional stress. And by doing it purposely, that poltergeist agent is, purposely and non-psychically, that poltergeist agent is blowing off steam, causing the phenomena to stop. A couple of my mentors had witnessed some of this imitative fraud. In fact, in one case, John Palmer, who had been doing a case in Michigan, and saw this. It was a little girl whose parents had died, and she was living with her grandparents. And there were all sorts of things that were happening, including the grandmother or grandfather saying that they got whacked on the rear end every once in a while, or on the back or something like that. And John witnessed when the grandmother was in the kitchen, because he stayed there for quite a while. When the grandmother was in the kitchen, he witnessed the girl sneaking in and hitting grandmother, running off. So during the debriefing with the family, John thought, okay, it must be all fraud. They're sitting there and John is explaining all this, and the little girl's getting very antsy, and a chair on casters in the room rolled across the room very fast, hit the wall, and fell over. At which point John said, I guess I have to rethink this. So it turned out that it was imitative fraud with a real phenomena. So that can happen as well. All right, Tina, start a Spotify channel. I got enough on my plate. Sorry. I think it's better if I post it on my website, because then I'm in more control of things. And thanks, Paul, for saying you enjoyed the interview with Steve. Let's see. Mary Lee Stone also saw your cat for years after he died. Yeah, I hear this from people quite a bit. There are books on animal ghosts or pet ghosts you can find. A lot of good stories that are out there. Thoreau enjoyed your recent interview with San Ching. I didn't even know that was up. So I'll have to look for that. He didn't send me a note. I don't remember if I posted that one or not. Too many things in my head at this point. Yeah, that is a cool planchette. I actually have the Ghostwriter here too. Oddly enough, I bought this at Barnes & Noble a few years ago, and I've seen it. So I'm pretty sure you can buy it. It's produced by, Oh, I guess there's not. I don't see a publisher on here. If you go to theenchantedworld.com, you might find it. Sterling Publishing is who did it. And this particular planchette has a little book with it, and it's an oddly shaped planchette, but it's kind of interesting. So here it is. And a Bic pen, a regular, like, 19-cent Bic pen goes right through there and works just fine. So, and then the book is about automatic writing. There's a lot of stuff out there that's non-Ouija board oriented. There's different, obviously, the company Parker Brothers makes a lot of Ouija board, different patterns. I mean, I have like 5 downstairs from them. I have a Stranger Things Ouija board. I have a glow-in-the-dark Ouija board, a couple of others. At one point in the 90s, they made a Barbie Ouija board. And then there are other companies that make spirit talking boards as well. In fact, I have a limited edition Bureau of Paranormal Research and Development, which is Hellboy, the comic book. I have a limited edition Hellboy board. And I even have one that I bought at a science fiction convention, which has got the TARDIS on it and all the letters on it. And it is a Doctor Who talking spirit board. So pretty cool stuff. They're all out there as well. There's one you can get called Memento. This is called, find this one. Tabula Mortem, which is around, it's another board. This was actually really inexpensive, which was surprising. I think it was like under $20, and it's a foldable board. And the best thing about this particular one, and I know I'm going off on a tangent here, the board's kind of cool. You kind of unfold it, and it's got lettering and stuff on it. And then this is the planchette. It's brass, and it has a little hole at the end because it comes with a chain, so you can use it as a pendulum also. Very heavy pendulum. But I mean, this is like one of the most worthwhile for the money. Ouija boards still cost stuff, and they're not made very well. But that you can also, for those of you that are really into this stuff, you can go onto Etsy and put in either spirit board or Ouija board, and people are making handmade ones, which range anywhere from really cheap ones under $10 to hundreds of dollars that are beautiful. And I actually have some boards, some craft boards downstairs as well. So I've got a lot of those kind of boards here in the house. Not had any problem with spirits. I'll tell you that right now. Let's see here. Paul, you've used several Ouija boards. Nothing paranormal ever happened. I've used several Ouija boards. Nothing paranormal has ever happened either. Sam posted the video a few days ago. Okay. Was told never to use a Ouija board as it can open portals and let negative spirits. No, only if you have that intention, you don't need a Ouija board. The thing that gets me the most is that any form of attempted spirit communication can be negative. If you do EVP at a place where there was a murder committed, but you won't use a Ouija board because that'll be to bring up, allow evil to come through, you're fooling yourself. Not that evil comes through. This is about your intention. EVP is spirit communication. Ouija boards allow you to drive the spirit communication, but EVP happens because if it's real, a spirit or an unconscious of a human being who's present is affecting the recording device. That's what's happening. It's not because the spirit is saying something out loud. It's not acoustical. We know that for a fact. So whether it's a spirit or a living person or a combination of the two, we really can't say. When you use a Ouija board, negativity can come through because your unconscious mind can present that, depending on the intention. So teenagers playing around and saying, I'm going to contact Pazuzu or some other weird demon or something like that, naturally you're going to get some weird stuff coming through. Usually if it's a teenager, because one of the teens is screwing around with the others. I used to be that teenager. I used to screw around with my friends. Not because there's an actual demon coming through. It's the unconscious that's doing that. So, but people have differing beliefs about about any attempted spirit communication. There are people who will say never try to communicate with spirits because that could generate some bad stuff, even if you have good intentions. It doesn't seem to be, from our perspective in parapsychology, it doesn't seem to be the case for things. So, and as far as portals, that's an interpretation of what people think, that the spirits have to come through a portal or something like that. They have to open up some sort of window. That doesn't seem to be the case at all. And especially with apparitions who are present. So there is a difference between the cases we can investigate with ostensible apparitions, ghosts, and people from the other side communicating back through mediums. Now, a medium might be able to communicate with generally can communicate with a spirit who's present here. So we differentiate in parapsychology. We find that the apparition cases we're dealing with, or the apparitions that people see or experience within anywhere from time of death to a week, it's usually 3 days. You see somebody dies in your family, you see them, you experience them, they're gone. Those apparitions, when you experience them, they are here present in the physical world. They may not be physical the way we think of it, but they're still present in the physical world. In fact, they have not moved on yet. Many mediums call them ghosts, and they use the word spirit to refer to someone who's moved on to the next level of existence, the other side, whatever you want to call it, and are projecting back to communicate with the living. Different than actually being here. It's long distance communications, you might say, versus in person. So there's no need for a spirit who's present in the physical world to use a portal unless they want to walk through a portal like a door or come through a window. Those two are portals. So, and they're portals that we use all the time. The idea of creating some sort of window or some sort of opportunity, that doesn't have, it has belief, but we don't see any evidence of it directly. And we see many interpretations of the same thing in general. Patrick started reading Chasing the Dark. Yeah. Tony Cornell. Tony Cornell, and I unfortunately only had an opportunity to have a phone call with him and then spend the day with him in the early 2000s. I really, really wish I had gotten to know him better, more. The book is, I think the book is good. There's some questions, Tony had his own, and we talked about that the day that I visited with it, when we were doing an event for the Parapsychology Foundation. In fact, you can find this on YouTube if you go to the Parapsychology Foundation's channel and just put in Tony Cornell or put in real busting, I'm trying to remember what the actual title of this is. See if I can find this really quickly. There's actually a 2-part busting ghosts session, kind of a seminar we did. We did a most of the day session where I spoke, Carlos Alvarado spoke, one of my colleagues who was working with the Parapsychology Foundation, Tony Cornell spoke, and Hans Holzer in his 80s, late 80s, spoke as well. And then we had a panel discussion. You can find that on the Parapsychology Foundation's website. And there's actually several videos with Tony Cornell on the Parapsychology Foundation's YouTube channel. Again, go to YouTube and put in Parapsychology Foundation, type in Tony Cornell, just type that in. He did one on how to see a medium. He did some others as well. And really great session with him that I spent time with him on. He did have some very specific beliefs about, he wasn't convinced that apparitions were conscious entities. But when we talked at the end of the day, after I presented, Carlos presented, we didn't really count what Holzer was saying, honestly. Tony thought that perhaps those of us who do investigations especially in parapsychology or psychical research, have attracted the kinds of cases that fit our bias or interpretations or belief systems. And Tony he said right off the bat, I was biased against apparitional cases. I just don't think, I had a good one. And he said, I wouldn't have believed him if I saw him, that kind of thing. Hauntings are different, poltergeist cases for sure. But I had no preconceptions. I really have no bias about the whole thing. And because of that, I've had all kinds of cases. And he thought that maybe he was not being open to apparition cases. Consequently, he didn't get those cases, which is an interesting way of thinking of it. And that seems to come through in the book as well, talking about some of his stuff. But it's a great book. I think The Chase in the Dark is a really good book. Tony Cornell wrote a book called Investigating the Paranormal, came out in the early 2000s. It's a shame it's out of print. I am going to talk to the people who published it at some point and see if we can get or talk, and who has the rights, whether the family has the rights. If the family has the rights, and I can't promise anything, I'm really hoping that we can get that book reprinted by Paranormal Daily News' new publishing arm. So that would be a really good thing. Randy, you have a very old William Fuld Ouija board that you retrieved from a poltergeist case you worked. The experiencers thought the board was probably connected, probably not, but you know. And I was a number of years ago, I went to a friend of a friend's father had died south of San Francisco, and she was cleaning up the house, and she felt his presence, and yeah, he was kind of hanging around making sure everything got taken care of before they sold the house, apparently. But there was a pile of stuff they were getting rid of, and there was a Swami board, which was one of the knockoff Ouija boards from the 1930s and 40s, and she gave it to me, so I have that. It's not as old, probably. It wasn't wood, but it was masonite, so it's kind of still a hard one. Do you think the field of parapsychology can define the paranormal or neatly place all the unknowns within its parameters? Well, I mean, we have definition of what we study. The word paranormal first got applied to psychic phenomena, which included what eventually became known as extrasensory perception, real-time ESP, sometimes called clairvoyance, or remote viewing is there. We have precognition, knowing before. We have telepathy. Those are the three main areas of, and there are variations of these abilities or these experiences. We look at psychokinesis, or mind over matter, and that runs the gamut of possibly affecting our own bodies, depending on your definition, because that is mind over matter, to healing, to spoon bending, metal bending, moving objects, affecting devices. And then we have the category of survival of bodily death, looking everything from apparitions to out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, reincarnation. All of those things fall into consciousness-related psychic experiences or psychic abilities. And that's parapsychology. We don't deal with UFOs, although we might deal with someone who is an experiencer who's suddenly having psychic experiences. We don't deal with Bigfoot. Find a Bigfoot, find out he's psychic, bring him to the lab, we'll deal with him. We don't deal with most of that stuff. The last thing I'll do, and I'll stay a couple of extra minutes on this, a colleague up in Scotland who can't attend live asked about time slips, the idea that people might perceive something, either be in a different time period, might experience something from another time period. There's a story that's been written up called there's a book called Adventures in Time, out of print. Ghosts of the Trianon is another one, where these two women were at the Palace of Versailles in France, and they went off tour and they went to the garden, and suddenly they're like amidst all these people in period garb from, I think, the 17th century, 18th century. And people are looking at them funny, and it seems very physical, and they kind of leave and come back again, and there's nobody there. And they may have wandered, the idea is they maybe wandered into a time slip, kind of a two time periods rubbing against each other. Matthew Manning, the psychic in England, had an experience with that, where people were mistaking what they were seeing, which Matthew said was a time slip, for ghostly stuff, but was more like a time slip. And then there have been the other kinds of time slips, which are clear indications that time skips in some areas. There was one that was confirmed. It was only for a couple of minutes between an island in the Pacific and two atomic clocks. One was out of sync for a couple of minutes, as were all the other clocks. Something happened on the island. There was a case that Martin Caden reported of a jumbo jet coming into, or it was a was on a jumbo jet. I think it might have been a 727 coming into Reagan National Airport in the DC area. This is years ago, like in the 1970s. And it's coming in in the evening at night. It's already dark. And as it's coming in, it disappeared off radar much sooner than it should have when it's coming in for a landing. So actually, they scrambled emergency vehicles to the tarmac because they thought maybe it had come down. They didn't see it on the runway. They thought maybe it had come down and like landed off to the side or something like that. Something had happened. The ambulances and everything gets out there. Suddenly, the plane is overhead. This is 10 minutes after they first notice it missing. It lands. People on the aircraft saw nothing on the tarmac, on the runway, and then they saw these emergency vehicles like that. And the plane, according to Marty, was then not taken to the gate. It was taken to a hangar where there were people actually waiting to interview everybody about what had just happened. So was that a time slip or something else? But time slips are not part of what we study in parapsychology. They're endlessly fascinating. They're not psychic phenomena unless a human being somehow caused it with their consciousness. But they can be mistaken, if they're real, they can be mistaken for ghostly phenomena, in which case we would probably then shuffle them off to somebody else in the physics world, because time slips are a physics problem, not a parapsychology or paranormal problem. But the TV shows have already defined the paranormal as apparitions, hauntings, and poltergeists, and that's it. Paranormal means on the side of normal. In reality, psychic experiences, and even ghostly stuff, is not paranormal. It's normal. It's part of the normal human experience, and we need to get the mainstream to accept that in some way, shape, or form. And on that note, we are past the half hour. I want to thank you all for joining me. My producer will be back, barring any sort of real bad weather again, in 2 weeks. I hope you are too. I will, in fact, look into the audio pieces and being able to put them up on my website. I'm pretty sure I can, if I actually can find them, I can find some place to put them, I'm sure. And I have to go back through and check out some of the things that other folks mentioned through the chat. Thanks again for joining. And I will be back on February 8th. Same bat time, same bat channel. Good night.